to the story of us. Oh, I should have made some people co-hosts to let folks in. Samantha, you're being co-hosted, and Marion, you're being co-hosted if you're okay with it. Though, if you'd like us to call you Leon, as your name on here suggests, we're whatever you want to go by, we're here for.
I help him get on, and sometimes he's Marion, and sometimes I'm Leon.
We like both of you.
Right now, though.
Oh, two Leons. We have two Leons.
In that case, she has to be Marion.
Yeah. Okay. So welcome back together, everyone, for Story of Us, the ongoing story of who the Jewish people have been, and even more so the story that we have told ourselves about who we are. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. As always, unmute yourself if you have something to add. Don't be shy. So I've been thinking about just sort of this meta idea of the story of us, backing away for a moment, which is the idea that the Jews are the people who have told ourselves this story. There's so much discussion right now when it comes to Israel and Palestine about this idea of indigenous. Right, everyone has caught this conversation, I assume. Zoomers, by the way, when you see me look this way, I'm actually looking at the TV, looking at you. It just feels like I'm looking away. I apologize. First of all, I think indigenous is a problematic category, period. It's clearly a social construct, and when you start poking at it, it's really problematic in just about every situation. Certainly Palestinians are indigenous to the land. Jews have also had as a part of, I think, how we've understood ourselves, not with that word has become very political, but the sense of also being indigenous to the land. And that's a part of the issue here. And so in the end, what is the difference between a Palestinian and a Jew? At some level, if you're talking about Jews whose families have been Jews for thousands of years, you can trace them back maybe to the same individual, to the same shared great whatever grandparents, and yet the difference is what story we have told ourselves about who we are, and that is always changing. The whole notion, for instance, that Palestinians are Arab is a new notion that comes from the project of Arab colonialism that spread throughout the region and changed identity. The whole notion that people in the North and the South would both become Jews was a whole, right? All of these through time, when we tell ourselves a new story of who we are, it replaces something old. So to be a Jew is to be a part of this group, I really believe it, that has said, this is the story of who we are. Even as that story has changed and is constantly changing. Does that make sense? Any thoughts on that? Was that a different sort of articulation of what we're doing?
It makes a lot more sense than anything else I've ever heard.
Okay, good. I'll take that. I'll take that. Any other thoughts on that? Zoomers, anyone? Okay. So let's dive back into where we are at in our timeline. We have been making our way through the negative numbers, the BCE, the before the Common Era, also known as BC. BCE is the academic term as opposed to AD, as opposed to BC. The academic term on the other ends are CE versus AD. So I will tend to use the academic terms BCE and CE. But if you're more familiar with BC and AD, it's the same idea. I hope I just confused everyone with that sentence, but there we go. Okay, so we've been making our way up towards the year zero, and today our goal is to really look at the Jewish world of the year zero. We have constantly had this theme of the Northern Empire, of Assyria, of Babylon, of Persia, of the Seleucid Greek Empire. It's all sort of the same region. In the Southern Empire, based in Egypt, around the Nile and the Delta. In whether we called that the Egyptian Empire or it became the Ptolemaic Greek Empire or whatever name we are giving it, this has been this ping pong ball back and forth. And this is what we really talked about last week. We looked at the years, call it 350 BCE through about the year 0. And the theme over and over again was actually us being shifted between these two great powers, and the ways that these two great powers, even as they changed their own leadership, were constantly fighting these battles against each other. We ended last week in about 68 BCE with the rise of the Roman Republic in this region. That the Northern Empire, the Seleucid Empire, that had replaced the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, decided to reunite their empire with Greece itself. They attack Greece, they lose terribly. There are all these concessions that are made, and as a part of their loss, those Greeks living on the Greek peninsula invite or create an alliance with the Roman Republic. And the Roman Republic comes to their aid, and that is the moment that really the Roman Republic becomes one of the dominant political forces, and soon to be the dominant political force of the region. Okay, did that make sense? Any questions on last week, on the summary we just covered, on any of that? Zoomers in person? No one? Okay, so I'm going to share, let me spotlight this for everyone. There we go. Okay, I have a new way of sharing screens this time that I'm hoping will be better for those who watch it later as a recording. Okay, this is the Roman Empire around the year 117 AD, or CE, as I said we were going to call it. We've got two different categories. These are categories of how Rome controlled the region, either an imperial province or a senatorial province. Some of this is about the timing as well, with the empire being much larger than the republic. But the thing that really stood out to me that I'm not sure I had fully internalized beforehand is that the Roman Empire is a Mediterranean empire. Right? It includes some areas outside of the Mediterranean, in particular Britain. But really what we are talking about with the Roman Empire is control of the entirety of the Mediterranean. Actually, I was, in preparation for today, I was reading all sorts of different pieces, and one of the remarkable things about this era is that it's the first time in known history that a region was cleared of piracy, because Rome controlled the entirety of the Mediterranean. And so the empire really exists along this region, and this becomes the region of Jewish existence for much of the next 1,000 years or so. Okay, so just taking a look right here, right? We have the old version of what we call the Northern Empire up here. And then we had the Southern Empire, this area on Egypt, around Egypt. We have all of these areas of Arabia and sort of the other areas of North Africa that are not along the Mediterranean. Those are not a part of the empire, often because those are desert regions that just weren't worth the control of the Romans for an empire that was about controlling the Mediterranean. But it means that Rome is effectively combining Europe, Southern Europe in particular, Southern and Western Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, a part of Europe, but its own thing in many ways, the north of the African continent, all the way through Judea, through Israel. And I actually think that this map helps to make clear why Judea is so important, because you can see that what is this region? It's the far eastern edge of the Mediterranean. And as notions of empire are expanding, as the global map is expanding beyond just the sort of regional into a much larger transcontinental empire here, you can see why the control of Judea was just so essential. Okay, thoughts, questions, anything here? Let me change it back so those in this room can see everyone else instead of sitting and looking at me.
I thought Iberia was was Spain, Portugal, that peninsula, but you have it like north of Judea.
There's another region that this map is marking as Iberia, and it must have to do with Roman names for the region. I noticed that too. Ignore that for now.
Okay. Also, on the BCE and the BC, I was trained that BCE stood for before the Common Era instead of saying before the Christian era.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Before the Common Era is BCE, and Common Era is CE. Exactly.
Common to who?
The common name. Yes, exactly. The commonly agreed upon thing having to do with Jesus, that we're trying to create a word that doesn't have to do with Jesus, even as we're counting based on Jesus. Even as it has nothing to do with Jesus' actual birthday, and instead later mythological ideas of Jesus' birthday era. So Common Era and before Common Era is just easier. Yeah, I think is the answer. Yeah, Ray.
So Danny, is there any relevance to occasional Holy Roman Empire?
Yeah, that comes later.
Okay.
That comes later, and will have to do with once the Roman Empire splits up again. It's going to split into these previous constituent parts that we're familiar with, by the way. As you hear about the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire, you're basically talking about Europe versus the Assyrian Empire. And then sometimes the European Empire includes some of those northern African areas, but sometimes that becomes its own region too. So we really see the historical empires of the Southern Empire, Egypt, the Northern Empire, Persia, and the Western, which wasn't an empire until later, in the Gauls and the Huns and the so on and so forth. But so that's what we're dealing with in that language, and that will come in a few weeks. Paul, and then Leon/Marion, and then Toby.
So, quick question. Who were there? I mean, the Roman Empire had to take it over from other people and other factions. Who was their enemy during this time?
So Rome is constantly waging wars on all of these groups as they're unifying these various constituent pieces. Right, at some level, the Greeks, with their empire in the north and the south, the Greeks take over the Persian Empire, right, and they call it the Seleucid Empire. They take charge of the Egyptian Empire. They call it the Ptolemaic Empire. But these are controlled by Greek, often Greek-born, certainly ethnically Greek-educated, pushing Greek civilization, Hellenization folks. And this is existing for hundreds of years at this point. So it lays the foundation for common empire. And then as Rome becomes the empire of first Mediterranean Europe, and then expands over into northern Africa and further east into what had been Assyria, Persia, whatever we're going to call that region, Mesopotamia, we're seeing a merger of these three empires. Or to say it differently, it's a unification of all of the empires that controlled Mediterranean ports. Marion.
I have reason to believe that the common is reference to everybody that goes by the year 2024. It was a late change. I mean, they didn't change from Christian to common until the 20th century. And I think that that's what it was based on, is international commerce and everything these days.
Yep. Bobby's noting that the audio is being weird for him. Is anyone else having audio issues? No? Great. Okay. Thanks, Marion. Toby.
I'm assuming that the senatorial provinces were the provinces that were controlled by Rome before it became
the Republican provinces as opposed to the empire provinces. Yeah, we just didn't get a date listing it on there. But if you're interested in that, by the way, that comes from a Vox article, which is called something like 28 Maps Which Explain the Roman Empire. Okay, any other questions, any other thoughts, anything else before we go on? Marilyn. Oop, you were unmuted and then you muted yourself. There you go.
There we go. What language? Are they forcing Latin on everybody?
So we're seeing Latin spread as the language of the empire. Certainly, Greek continues to be an incredibly important language of the empire. There's a reason, for instance, that Christian scriptures are significantly written in Greek as opposed to Hebrew or Aramaic. Aramaic will continue to be an important language of the regions that had been Aramaicized, meaning mostly Mesopotamian areas. So yeah, we will see the spread of Latin as the lingua franca during this time, but it's going to take some time. Great question. And really we're talking about Latins, right? We see a development of Latin and various regional dialects. And by the way, that's how we end up with all of the Romance languages. Romance, by the way, if you aren't familiar, not named after how beautiful they sound, but as in coming from Rome. And that includes, let's see, Romanian, which you don't think of as a Romance language, but Romanian, it's right in the name. Romanian, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian, I believe, are the 5 major Romance languages. Okay, any other questions before we keep going?
Or
I'm muted. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go for it, Perlis.
Hi. What was the ethnic makeup of the soldiers of the Roman legions?
Yeah, great question. That's actually been where I've been diving in on a lot of my research right now. The Roman legions are often very multi-ethnic, and depending on the time period, are often staffed by people from the far-flung edges of the empire, as well as local infantries that would be brought into the army. But significantly, and that's going to be one of the themes we're going to have today, the Roman army enforces in many of these places a military occupation, and often a brutal military occupation, meaning it's an outside group and a visibly outside group, dress, speech, culture, who are enforcing military rule over the region. That's going to be very important to how we're discussing today. Okay, any other questions before we... Okay, I'm hitting the mute everyone button. As always, feel free to unmute. Okay, so let's place ourselves around the year 0. Just before this, in the years leading up towards 0, though no one living then would have known they were on their way towards 0, we see this region of Judea controlled as sort of an independent space, a vassal state of the empire, might be the way to say it. This is the time when we have King Herod and groups like this, and there's just such enormous corruption that eventually, after requests from Jews, Roman historians call it a popular uprising of Judeans begging to become a province rather than just a vassal state. This region is combined, Judea is combined with Samaria, which today is the West Bank, and had not been a part of Judea before this, though it had been a part of various versions of Judea as in Israel leading up to this, but had not been a part of it, and it certainly as a political unit at this point, is combined with Samaria and a few other regions and becomes the Roman province of Judea. This is really a part of the larger Roman state of Syria, and that's how the relationship continues to be. That there is a Roman province of Judea that is a part of this broader Syrian province, which is itself part of the Roman Empire. Okay, does that make sense as the politics of it? So as you can imagine, when the Romans make this officially a part of the empire, there are people who are very happy about this. There are people who, particularly those who are connected and in the upper echelons, all of a sudden have opportunities for wealth and growth and trade and education that just did not exist prior to this. And there are people who are extremely unhappy about this as well. So one of the most unhappy folks that we have is a guy named Judas of Galilee. So we know exactly where he's from, right? He's a Judean from the north living around the Galilee. That's actually outside of the original province of Judea as far as the Romans were concerned. What do we know, by the way, immediately about him? By his name? What should the name Judas be What bells should be going off in our head?
Hasn't Judas Iscariot?
Okay, as in Judas Iscariot, what I'll say is it's the same connection as that Judas. There's a reason you get two Judases who show up in Christian scriptures as well, and you have this Judas. Who are they all named after? Judah Maccabee.
Judah. Okay.
Is that right?
They're named after Judah Maccabee. So remember, the Maccabees are, 160s BCE. So we are roughly 150 years later, living under Roman occupation. Think about what it means to name your child Judas. First of all, it's a sign of how Hellenized this region had become, that the name you're giving isn't even the original Hebrew name for Judah Maccabee, but is the Greek version of the name of Judah Maccabee. So the wildness of that and the cultural interchange there. But why would you name a kid after Judah Maccabee? What does that tell us about the family that does it?
That's where their belief system is. It's like someone today naming a kid Hitler because they were, enamored of that kind of government.
I wasn't going to say Hitler, but exactly. That's exactly what we're dealing with. It's a way to let us know that we are dealing with Jewish nationalists. These are people who are opposed to Rome to such an extent that they are naming their kids after just 150 years ago, that generation of freedom fighters who overthrew the Greeks. Make sense? So it's not a surprise that we get this guy who is a freedom fighter and rebels against Rome. He, by the way, is mostly saying that he's objecting to the taxes that are being collected. So some things never change. This is the Tea Party movement of 2,000 years ago or something. So this is what's happening in this context. There are all of these rebellions. There are all of these political movements, each of which is about the relationship from this point forward with Rome. So, does that make sense? Any questions, thoughts there? So I want to introduce a historical figure. We're going to be jumping between, call it the year 50 BCE and the year 50 or so CE, where that's the region we're in. The character of Josephus. And thanks to a friend of Lisa Huxley's, we have a 150 or so year old copy of Josephus's works right here. So Josephus has two different books that he's mostly known for. One is known as The Antiquities of the Jews, which is essentially a telling of global history from a Jewish perspective. Or I think maybe another way of saying it is, it's Josephus's version of the story of us, is one of those. The other is known as The Wars of the Jews, and details the war with the Romans from a sort of Jewish perspective. We'll talk about the problematics of that, and we'll talk about Josephus as a person in a moment. But first, let's talk about Josephus as a set of works, as these books. Josephus is the most, or I should say that these books right here are the single most important non-biblical tool that historians have to understand this historical moment. We have certainly the Christian scriptures, and today we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but for most of the last 2,000 years we did not have the Dead Sea Scrolls, but we did have Josephus and these works. So he's just been incredibly important for how we understand the various political groups during this time, how we understand the movements, how we understand the rebellion against Rome, even some references to some of these messianic figures, whether they be messianic rabbis or maybe the Jesus movement. There's some debate as to how much that shows up in here. But all of these various movements we get from Josephus, which would be wonderful, except he is a deeply untrustworthy historian. And let's talk about why it is that this is the case. So in the moment of these rebellions that we have, and we have a number of these rebellions between 50 and 50 or so, we're called 60 and 60, 70 and 70. We have a number of these rebellions against Rome, none of which end particularly well for Jews, by the way. And each of these rebellions can rightfully be understood as messianic movements. That's the notion of a messianic movement, is the rebellion against Rome. In fact, there's a recording of one of these rebellions leading to the crucifixion of 2,000 Jews in Judea. And eventually, by the way, there are enough rebellions that Romans destroy the area and even rename it to de-Judaize it, to get rid of the Jewishness of the region and rename the whole region Palestine, for a small group that had been on the coastal region long before this period. Okay. Josephus is one of the generals of the Judean Liberation Army during the rebellion against Rome, and gets into this enormous battle. By the way, there are a few pretty good battles where the Jews are able to beat Roman legions that come down from Syria, and then, of course, eventually, we're not beating Rome. Someone had asked last week about populations during this time period. I found a huge range of estimates as to what the Jewish population was. Somewhere between 4.5 and 8.5 million people are Jews by this point. We probably have at least 1 million. Again, I don't think you can. I'm not sure you can trust any of these numbers exactly, but take them, in the broadest of senses. About 1 million Jews living in Egypt at this point. Greek Egypt, primarily Alexandria, which makes us somewhere about 15 to 20% of Egypt. Jews are somewhere between 10 and 15% of the entirety of the Roman Empire. We're a pretty big group, with about 1 million of us outside of Egypt and Israel, Judea, throughout the Roman Empire itself. This is probably, by the way, as a share of the global population, the peak of the Jewish population. And should tell you something, that today the Jewish population, if we go with the upper estimate, which most scholars think is too high, but if we go to that upper estimate of 8 million or so Jews alive, there are only twice as many Jews alive today as there were then, to give you a sense. And the next 2,000 years of Jewish history will explain why it is that is the case, if you're not familiar. But we were a substantial chunk of the empire. In addition, you'll remember we talked in the last few weeks about the Greek challenge to Jewish thought. But even more so, we touched on this idea that a number of Greek thinkers thought admiringly about Judaism. In particular, this notion of monotheism. The more philosophical groups really were attracted to it and really seemed to respect Jewish practices around this. The most notable Jewish practice around monotheism was that Jews throughout the empire refused to enter into temples. We wouldn't go and have offerings. And we even find during this time period, based on who the Roman prefect of the region is at various times, that Roman coins are minted in Judea, the Roman province of Judea, without images on them. They don't have pictures of people, in order to not be symbols of idolatry. Another sort of piece of context around that, I assume most people are familiar with Jesus going into the temple and overturning the money changers, right? Even if you don't know it very well, everyone's sort of familiar with that story, right? Why were there money changers in the temple?
So many cultures, so many different nationalities coming in, needing to have an exchange of money.
It's so many different groups coming in. You had to have an exchange of money. Yeah, okay. In that way, it's the same as the duty free when you land.
Taxes. They needed to have Roman coins to pay their taxes.
Okay, they had to have Roman coins to pay their taxes, so certainly money changing the other direction. But there's money changers in the temple itself. Yeah, Leon. You got to unmute yourself, though.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
All right. They could not. They came from distances, and they couldn't bring animals with them. So some of the coins were used to buy animals at the temple for for sacrifice.
So that's why it exists in the first place, right? That when you were offering a sacrifice, it was a schlep to bring a goat from the north, so you instead brought the monetary value and bought it there. But here's why there are money changers. Because gold is gold is gold. You can weigh it, you can, right? They're money changers because coins would have had images of gods. Roman emperors would have been considered gods themselves, right? And you couldn't bring idolatrous images into the temple. So there's a whole economy of changing your coins for coins that you could bring in that existed there. I also think this is a great insight into the difference between sort of the imagined ideas of the elite and most people. Because the elites, the Jewish story that we tell ourselves even today about that time, everyone was pious and kosher keeping and wouldn't worship any idols. And by the way, if no one was worshiping idols, then there would be no reason for the Bible to be so obsessed with getting rid of idolatry. But if Jews refused to have ritual items that had images that were idolatrous on them, then we wouldn't have needed money changers at the temple. Which is to say that everyday Jews are going around with whatever coins they need or have, and then would have to, achieve a different ritual level to enter the temple than maybe they kept at home. Which is to say that it's the equivalent, and I think we probably all know Jews like this, that keep very strict kosher, but at home, but will happily go to a restaurant and have, double bacon cheeseburgers or whatever it is. That there are these boundaries that we have, and that humans have always been this way, and Jews have always been this way. So again, I mentioned this to overthrow that image that we have internalized, that everyone was pious and orthodox beforehand.
So all of these unimaged coins are made also in Judea?
So we have some official Roman coins without images that are made at various points. But then there would have been special coins that you could, swap out at the temple for entering into the temple with a very reasonable fee on top, I'm sure. Yep.
So why is Jesus praised for having destroyed this industry?
It's a pretty corrupt industry. Right? It is an industry that entirely exists to make money off of legalisms that people don't seem to be caring about. At least as I understand it.
It was to be religiously pure, but it was really to make money.
Yeah. We're going to get a Christian scholar in here of the early New Testament when we get there. So let's ask that question to them. Yes. Yeah. Avi Mazeo's comparing it to TurboTax here. I like that. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts on sort of this context setting that we've gotten here? One more note that's really not what we're talking about, but maybe will be a helpful concept. We're all familiar with the idea of ritual purity for entering into the temple. Mm-hmm. Today, by and large, the only remnant of this is, of course, enforced on people who menstruate, that they have to go to a mikvah after finishing menstruation and then 2 weeks following. And by the way, the rabbis get rid of the requirement for mikvah anytime someone has an ejection of semen, but keep it for menstrual emissions. Right. I'm sure it's a total accident that the biology of the ancient rabbis matched up with that. But the idea of ritual purity is totally misunderstood by us when we look at it. It's understood in moral terms or in cleanliness terms. But it is really, are you fit for entry into a special place, which means coming to that special place with special ritual status in place. It's not better, it's not clean, it's not pure, it's fit, right? You can go and exist as a semen-emitting, menstruating, touching dead people. These are the main categories of becoming ritually impure. Human being out there in the world. You just can't enter into the confines of the temple until you have literally washed, because we're talking about immersion in a mikveh, literally washed away the fluids of life. And that's really sort of the idea, is that we become contaminated with the fluids of life, whether it is the presence of a dead person or menstrual or seminal or any of these categories. So throw away your notions of purity or holiness or anything else. It is, you don't have cooties, so you can come into this room, but as soon as you contract cooties, you're going to go need to take a bath, and then you can come back into the sacred cootie-free zone that is the temple. Okay, I think we explained that while maintaining all of the sacred notion of the temple here. Okay, any thoughts or questions around that from anyone? The temple is central during this time to religiosity and to politics. And who controls the temple is a political question with religious implications. But I really want to suggest that the religious implications just add weight to the politics. They add symbolism to the politics. They don't change the reality that what we are dealing with is a political, not theological issue. Who are the rightful priests to be operating in the temple is also a question of who is collaborating with the Romans in appropriate or inappropriate ways. You don't get to be the head of the temple unless you collaborate with the Romans. So for people who are opposed to the Romans, period, and have messianic images of a Mediterranean empire, a global empire controlled by us instead of them, then you can understand what's going on here, what the problematics of this are. I totally just lost my train of thought. Back me up, someone. My brain just went like totally numb.
Political, not theological.
Political, not theological. Who's in charge of the temple? Thank you. So we have people who will reject the legitimacy of the temple altogether, which is rejecting the legitimacy of Rome and those who collaborate with them. That's what they're really saying. They're not saying you need to splatter the blood a little more in this direction and you've been doing it too much in that direction. They're not even really saying it's that family that should be in charge instead of this family. What they're saying is that you are illegitimate collaborators. Then there are the people who are working in the temple, the political elites, the powerful who are becoming ever more powerful because they're not only taking in the taxes, and that's what the temple is, it's a reservoir of tax income, but they're also working with the Romans and engaging in trade and all of the beauties of corruption that come with this, and the money changers and the so on and so forth. So you have those groups. You have the masses of regular Judeans who are too busy living their lives to really care much about any of this. Okay, we've got the Romans before, we had the Seleucids, then we had the Ptolemies, and then we had the this and the right, all the way back. There's always going to be a boss. New boss is the same as the old boss. Those are the people who go along to get along. And that's the biggest chunk of people who are living in this region. If you've ever seen an analysis of revolutions that happen in various countries, they're almost always led by the middle class, the upper middle class. The wealthy are too invested in the status quo. The working class and the poor don't have enough time or resources to rebel. It's the upper middle class where these rebellions are happening. And similarly, that's what we see during this moment. It's the middle class who aren't on the inside of the temple and kind of wish they would be, who are the biggest agitators against the status quo. Make sense? Let's give some names to some of these groups. And here we are going to be borrowing from Josephus, who says that there are 4 groups. Almost certainly there are more than 4 groups, and let's not forget that we can't trust Josephus. In fact, I don't think I ended Josephus's story. Josephus is this general of the Judean army who is about to lose a big battle to the Romans and throws up the white flag and says, "Hey, Emperor, actually, just so you know, there's a whole prophecy that says that you, Titus, are going to become the emperor, and wouldn't it be great if I could hang around with you instead of..." And so Josephus goes from being a Judean rebel general to being the official suck-up historian for the Roman emperor. He writes these books, The Wars of the Jews and the history of the Jews, the history of the world from a Jewish perspective, for a Roman and Greek audience. He writes them for the emperor, paid for by the emperor. So he's entirely not trustworthy. I mean, both because of his biography and because of the incentives of what he would say, wouldn't say, and couldn't say because of who he was and what he was writing for. Does that make sense? Okay. So, Josephus talks about 4 different groups, and we are going to work with those 4 different groups, even as we acknowledge that these are probably closer to categories than they are individual groups. Maybe it's closer to saying conservative, liberal, progressive, fascist. Fascist people don't call themselves anymore, but alt-right, right? Like these groups that are not political movements and encompass. Sometimes they overlap with parties, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they have multiple. It's closer to that than saying libertarian, Democrat, Republican, Green Party. Mm-hmm. So categories rather than specific groups. Let me name the 4, and then we will dive into them. Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. These are the 4 groups. Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. I also think we should imagine the Sadducees as being the Democrats and the Republicans, and all of the other groups as being the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, the Constitution Party, the whatever party, which is to say that you've got your mainstream and you've got your fringes. And that's the setup I really want us to have during this time period, is that we have the mainstream, which includes that big chunk of human beings living in this region who go along to get along, and certainly includes the leadership. Sadducees are very much connected with the temple and the operations of the temple, which again means that they are working with the Romans. They are collaborating, probably in the negative and positive senses of that word, with the Romans. Which, to collaborate with the Romans at some level, is like the Missouri governor collaborating with the Americans. Right? This is a state within a larger empire. To not collaborate with the Romans just meant you weren't in charge. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So that's the Sadducees. The Sadducees we should think of as being Roman collaborators and the mainstream operators of the temple. Mainstream Judaism at this time, mainstream Jewish practice, was Sadducean Jewish practice. There's some distinctive things that we learn about them from Josephus, including they don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, and they're not terribly messianic in general. Okay, questions about Sadducees? Feel like we understand them a little bit, have a window into them. And we don't really have percentages that we can throw on the population from this time period. There weren't good public policy polling, it turns out. But we're just going to call them, for our purposes, about 80% of the population. We're going to throw into that category of Sadducee, or Sadducee affiliated, or not political enough to not be a Sadducee. Next group, the Essenes. I know that's not the order I gave it in before, but that's the next group we're going with now. Essenes we talked about a little bit last week. They are ascetics, by and large. Ascetic, meaning they're shunning pleasures of the world, whether that be artistic pleasures or sexual pleasures or food pleasures or whatever it is. And a big part of this is because they are some of the first eschatological folks that we find in the Jewish tradition. I've used that word before, but I'm going to go ahead and define it again. Eschatology is a view that history is leading in a particular direction. So actually, I'm going to explain this through contemporary white evangelical Christian eschatology. I think that's the frame that is going to make the most sense for us here. Many white evangelical eschatologies are pointing towards an end of days, when time and history are over and Jesus has returned. There's debate whether there will be 1,000 years after Jesus returns, of various periods before the final end, but history is moving in a direction with a plan so that it has a complete story. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to history, just like a good 5th grade essay. You can divide up those periods into distinct historical moments where the world is truly different in each of these moments. We still do this post-war period, pre-war period, but you go to any historian and they're going to argue, actually, that's not the place you should be dividing in 1940 instead of the... This is thick lines instead between these moments. Before the garden, or before the leaving of the garden, post-garden of Eden, until the flood, post-flood until Abraham until Moses, the attempt to do it with the people instead of just a family, Moses until Jesus, the attempt to reboot and make it universal for everyone, Jesus until his death, the in-between until Jesus comes back until and there's all sorts of divisions of how they do this in various groups. That's eschatology. Eschatology seems to have come back from Persia with us. We know that we're getting the war between good and evil, light and darkness, right and wrong from the Persians, from Zoroastrians. And we see a lot of this amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are hidden there between the years about 150 and 150. Is when we think the Dead Sea Scrolls are written. And the Dead Sea community, whether they are officially Essenes or not, will go into the broad category of Essenes as far as we're concerned in terms of Josephus. And so we see this. The Dead Sea Scroll community have all of these texts intermingled with biblical texts. It's one of the ways we know that the canon is not complete, is the Dead Sea community has every book from the Hebrew Bible except for Esther, but they also have all sorts of other books of their own that are clearly just as religious in nature that are interspersed there too, that to them probably would have been as much sacred as Proverbs or Ecclesiastes or whatever it is. And amongst these books, we have resurrection of the dead texts, we have messianism, we have texts about battles between good and evil that are coming, Armageddon texts. We have all of these fringier Jewish theologies. Now, think for a moment think sociologically or psychologically even, about afterlife and messianism and resurrection of the dead. What sort of factors, when you really think about it, lead someone to really feel connected to those ideas? And it's almost always when you feel powerless to accomplish in life what you want to. We see this across the board. The equivalence of messianism and afterlife theologies in every culture, because every culture has their version of these ideas, even as they're not the specific categories. When things get bad, these ideas become much more prominent.
I believe that slavery period is a good example of a time when there was emphasis on the sweet by and by.
There you go, right? Exactly.
Anything's got to be better than this.
Anything's got to be better than this. And God has made promises to us, and the bounds of our lifetime, if God's not going to keep them now, God's going to have to keep them eventually. Someone was starting to speak. Was that Ray?
When the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there.
There you go. The other example I give is, are folks familiar with the song Anima Amin? Ani ma'amin, ani ma. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. It's a quote from Maimonides, who probably didn't mean any of those words. That's a different, we'll get to Maimonides later. But the melody that we have for it that most people sing is a melody that, at least the Baba Misa story goes, was sung on a train car to Auschwitz. And there was a little boy who was small enough to fit through the slats at the top, who fell off the train, and kept the melody of a train car of Jews singing Ani Ma'amin, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. I'm looking around and seeing people emotionally impacted by that, right? But I think the emotional impact, if you're feeling it right now, is exactly the point that we're making, which is that it is in those moments when messianism, the idea that God will intervene in history, political history, or the idea of afterlife becomes so much more important. So it should come as no surprise that the Sadducees are not particularly messianic nor afterlifey, and the Essenes and the Pharisees are. We haven't talked about the Pharisees yet. We'll get there in a second. But this is one of the huge disagreements that we have recorded from this time period, is the Sadducees saying there is no resurrection of the dead, and the Pharisees in particular having it as a core part of their belief system. Okay, Sadducees, Essenes. Essenes are the ascetics, going out into the wilderness or escaping civilization and waiting for the eschatological moment, the messianic moment. Any questions on these two groups before we add in the next two? Okay. I'm going to do Zealots first. We'll do Pharisees last. Pharisees are going to be the most complicated because Pharisees become the rabbinic movement. So the rest of Jewish history is going to be, in many ways, Pharisaical history. This is why when Pharisee is used in Christian spaces as a negative, it is an inherently anti-Semitic. And it's most often used by progressive Christians, by the way. They just don't see it. Pete Buttigieg got into trouble in whenever it was that he was that 4 years ago, whenever it was that he was running, because he was talking about a group as Pharisees. And he didn't get the context of, as many people don't. Okay, so the Zealots. The Zealot movement can be traced back to our friend Judas of the Galilee. Remember that the tax rebel against Rome. This is a group, and there's a few other names associated with it. They might be rival versions of different groups, but they're a large category. They're known as the Kenai. They're known as the Biryoni, as the Sicarii, and as the Zealots. And these are people who engage in targeted assassinations of Roman leaders and, in particular, Jewish collaborators with the Romans. I like the Sicarii group the best in terms of understanding this because it is named after the short knife that they would carry. And they would go dressed as everyone else into large crowds, swarm around collaborators, stab them, and slip away into the night. And these knives were so small that they could do it and be gone, and no one would see that they had weapons on them. This group eventually is blamed, at least, for the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, and we're going to look at an intra-Jewish text about that in coming weeks. Okay, those are the Zealots. One last note, there are some historians who believe that the Zealots are a group of Pharisees. That in fact, by and large, the Zealot movement was connected to the Pharisee movement, and that the distinction between these two groups is whether you would go along with the Romans, which the Pharisees seem to see the Romans as like gravity, something that you're not going to be able to overcome. And the Zealots, who have a messianic vision of God intervening and overcoming the Romans. Okay, makes sense? With our last 4 minutes, we're going to introduce the Pharisees, and then we'll spend most of next week talking about Pharisees. So the Pharisees are the precursor to the rabbinic movement. And the people we think of as the early rabbis almost certainly are Pharisees. These are people who had rejected the operations of the temple as being corrupt, as being illegitimate, which is to say they were rejecting Roman occupation and collaboration with Rome. And instead, they held up this idea that Jewish could be done outside of the temple. In this sense, they are building on a tradition that started with the Babylonian exile and the Jews who create Judaism centered around the Torah that came out of 450 BCE Persia, Babylon. They're also very clearly influenced by and perhaps a part of Hellenized Jews that we talked about last week, who were figuring out ways of doing Jewish throughout the empire. Now we're talking the Greek Empire, in particular North Africa, Egypt, places like Alexandria. They're building off of these social movements and these theological movements, but theology is after the fact. Don't let anyone convince you that theology drives anyone but the elites. It comes after the fact of the sociological pieces. And so they're building off of this. And in particular, they say that at the moment when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, that there was an oral Torah that was given from God to Moses as well, and that it had been passed down from generation to generation to generation, never to be recorded. And there's all sorts of stories. In fact, there's a midrash that says, this is a midrash that clearly comes after the Christian era has begun, that says, the nations of the world will come and steal our texts and claim them to be their own. I think the politics of who they're talking about is pretty straightforward there, which is why we never are to write down the oral Torah, because then it can never be taken by another group. Spoiler, the oral Torah is written down, and that is what the Talmud is, but we'll get there in coming weeks. But these Pharisees said there was another way of doing Jewish that was not dependent on the temple, which means there was another way of doing Jewish that wasn't dependent on political alliance with the Romans. And you could do it anywhere inside the Roman Empire, which is where Jews were living. You could do this Jewish. This is the rise of the synagogue movement. And a synagogue is just a space to gather together to do Jewish. That's what we see. One of the best texts we have about how the early synagogue movement operated is the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus shows up in a synagogue and reads a scroll of Isaiah, right? If you've read the Gospel of Matthew, you're familiar with this. What is Jesus doing? He's chanting the Haftarah. He's showing up on Shabbos and chanting the Haftarah, the selection from the prophets that's read to match up with the Torah portion each week. It's a misnomer to call Jesus a rabbi, but he's clearly deeply connected with this group of Pharisees. The last thing I want to say for today, to set the stage for next week, is that we need to not believe the later mythology of rabbis about this moment. Later rabbis of the Talmud talk about the great Sanhedrin that occurred, right? The council of rabbis that the king would go to and the Roman emperor would show up and ask questions about kashrut to the Sanhedrin. And besides the fantastical nature of the Roman emperor showing up and being interested in what the Sanhedrin has to say, the Sanhedrin almost certainly did not exist, and if it did exist, it was closer to a clown court that no one cared about than a court that politically important people would be a part of, because Pharisees are not politically important. When you think Pharisees from this era, you should think Green Party or Libertarian Party. That's what I want you to think about. And similar to the way that actually most most people will vote for a Democrat or a Republican. And if they're going to switch, they're going to switch between those two parties. But there is a fringe of people who vote for third parties. And often what they will do is switch between the third parties that they're voting for. That's how I want us to think of the Jesus movement, the Messianic movements, the Essenes, the Pharisees, and even the Zealots. Is they are all a part of this 20% fringe that by and large, they're not convincing anyone from the 80% to join them. They're just fighting between themselves over who gets what share of that 20% of the fringy people. Why is the Gospel of Matthew so anti-Pharisee? To the point where it has become, today, the Gospel of Matthew is a source of deep anti-Semitism. Historical has been a source of deep and violent anti-Semitism. But in its moment, the Gospel of Matthew is anti-Pharisee because the early Christian movement is competing with the early rabbinic movement for the hearts and minds of the fringy few. This is an intra-fringe argument that we are seeing totally out of context because later people like to imagine that the Jesus movement was historically important during this time, politically important during this time, and that the rabbis were politically important during this time, neither of which are terribly true. Okay. Questions, thoughts? I feel like we really set the stage for the Roman era today. We'll dig in with some details into the Pharisees, the early rabbis, the collaborators, and the Christian movement, or the Jesus movement, I should call it. We're actually not going to study the Christian movement much. We're going to study the Jesus movement within Judaism. And then we're going to look at how that stops being a Jewish movement as well. But that'll be different. Any questions? Any thoughts? Toby.
Hi, everyone. In the past, Danny, you have said that Judaism, up until recent modern times, was more of a tribe kind of thing rather than a religion. But what you're describing really sounds to me like a religion.
So you can't separate out these ideas. First of all, the idea of religion as a category is only about 250 years old itself. But you just can't separate them. To say that you are opposed to that the leadership of the temple is corrupt and therefore the offerings of the temple are not legitimate to our God is inseparable from a critique of Roman occupation. There is no possibility of the separation of church or state, even in concept. There's no way to differentiate between these politics. Let me give you a modern equivalent. ISIS is a messianic Muslim movement that is a response to the American occupation of Iraq. You can't look at ISIS as being a theological and not a political movement. And this is what I meant when I said earlier that I really deeply believe that theology is unimportant, that theology is an after-the-fact way of describing the sociology of the time. So did that make sense, Toby? Was that helpful?
Yeah.
Other questions, other thoughts?
I have a sort of comment. So I'm singing the St. John Passion with the Bach Society, and there's one short little chorus where the chorus of Jews shouts, "We have no king but Caesar," in response to Jesus being called King of the Jews. And this puts a lot of that in context for me.
Yes.
Talking about, and I think probably we'll talk about next week.
Yes. We have no king but Caesar is a call against rebellion. It's a political statement, and this is where the rabbis eventually get, by the way. The Pharisees eventually get there to a place that says rebellion against Rome will be suicide for our people.
And it's so fascinating how it's presented so differently in the Passions and in a lot of other spaces.
Well, and we've talked about this when we did a divergence and talked about Hanukkah. We mentioned this, but the reason that the Hanukkah story in the Talmud, which is written by rabbis, turns into a children's story about oil lasting instead of a political story about rebellion against the Greeks is because the danger of the political story to inspire rebellion against Rome.
Yeah.
Marion.
Avot starts with that lineage of how the knowledge was passed down. Is that this oral Torah that you're talking about?
Yes, and we're going to look at that exact verse. But yes, exactly that. And that's the first place that idea is written down, by the way. Or the first place we have. Okay. Good to be with everyone. See y'all next week.